The rain that fell on Clover Street that evening was the kind that makes the world feel smaller. It came down in slow, heavy sheets, pressing against the windows of warm houses, filling the gutters with dark, rushing water, and turning the old, cracked sidewalks into mirrors that reflected nothing but gray sky. By 7 in the evening, the street was completely empty. Porch lights had been switched off, curtains had been drawn. The neighborhood had folded itself inward the way people do when the weather gives them permission to stop caring about anything beyond their own four walls. Nobody looked outside, nobody listened, and so nobody heard the sound coming from the narrow alley between the old Callaway building and the abandoned hardware store. A sound so small and exhausted it barely qualified as a cry. It was more like a breath with a tremble in it, the kind of sound a living thing makes when it has been making noise for so long that the noise itself has given up. Inside a rusted wire cage, half hidden beneath a broken wooden pallet and a tangle of dead weeds, a small dog lay completely still. He was brown and white, with soft folded ears and a narrow chest that rose and fell with the shallow rhythm of a creature running very low on everything: warmth, water, hope. The cage had not been locked deliberately. It had simply been abandoned there, its latch jammed tight with rust and time, the way so many cruel things happen, not with intention, but with indifference. He had been there since before sunrise. He had scratched at the bars in the early hours. He had pressed his nose through the gaps and whimpered into the empty alley. But the morning had come and gone, and the afternoon had darkened into evening, and not a single person had turned their head. He had stopped trying sometime around noon. Now he simply lay there, his chin resting on his front paws, his eyes open but seeing very little. The particular stillness of an animal that has made a quiet, terrible peace with the possibility that no one is coming. She appeared at the entrance of the alley just as the rain began to worsen. A small stray cat, gray and white, her fur so thoroughly soaked that she looked half her actual size. She had no collar, no name, no destination. She was the kind of creature the world had long since stopped making room for, surviving on scraps and instinct, sleeping in whatever dry corner the city grudgingly offered. She should have turned around. She had her own survival to attend to, but something made her stop at the alley entrance and look. Her green eyes found the cage immediately. She stood very still for a long moment, the rain falling around her, her tail low and unmoving. Then she walked forward, slowly, carefully, without any of the caution that usually governs a stray cat's movements in unfamiliar territory. She walked as if she had already made a decision she didn't fully understand, but was not going to question. She circled the cage once, twice. Her nose worked along the base of the bars, reading everything the rain had not yet washed away. The dog lifted his head. His eyes, which had been so flat and distant, focused on her with something fragile and reluctant, the expression of a creature who has been disappointed too many times to allow itself to feel something as dangerous as hope. But the cat did not leave. She sat down in front of the cage door and studied the latch with an intensity that seemed almost architectural. Then she raised one small paw and pressed it against the rusted metal. She pushed. Nothing moved. She adjusted her angle and tried again. Again, nothing. She stepped back, shook the water from her face with a single sharp motion, and tried a third time. This time, working at the lower edge of the latch with both paws, her small body leaning into it with everything she had. The latch did not open, but the dog pulled himself upright. He moved toward the door on unsteady legs, drawn by something he could not name, perhaps simply the sight of another living creature that had chosen, without any obligation, to stay. He pressed his nose gently against the bars closest to where the cat was working, and for a moment the two of them were simply there together, separated by rusted wire. both of them soaking wet, both of them small against the size of the world pressing down on them. A man walked past the alley entrance then, middle-aged, hood pulled up, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He glanced briefly into the alley, saw nothing worth slowing down for, and moved on. His footsteps faded quickly into the sound of the rain. The cat went back to work. It was some time later, the minutes were impossible to measure in the steady gray blur of that evening, when the parrot arrived. He landed on the low wire strung between the two buildings above the alley with the practiced grip of a bird accustomed to perches, not wires. He was bright green, vivid as a piece of summer dropped into the middle of a gray winter night, with sharp, intelligent eyes that moved quickly between the cat and the cage below. He was not a wild bird. His feathers were too smooth, his stillness too comfortable around the evidence of human spaces. He had escaped from somewhere nearby or been let go, and now he sat above the scene below with an expression, if a bird can be said to have one, of deep and focused concern. He watched the cat work for a long time. Then he opened his beak. The sound he made was nothing like the cheerful mimicking noise of a pampered house bird. It was sharp and urgent and repeating, a cry that had a shape to it, a rhythm, almost a message. He called once and paused, called again and paused. Then he abandoned the pauses entirely and simply cried, his small body trembling with the effort, his voice rising above the rain and bouncing off the brick walls of the alley and spilling out onto the empty street beyond in waves that were impossible to ignore. The cat did not stop working. The dog pressed closer to the cage door, and the parrot cried and cried into the wet, dark evening, as if somewhere inside him some profound and wordless understanding had taken hold, the understanding that he was the only one of the three of them whose voice could carry far enough to matter. Harold Mears almost didn't take his walk that evening. He stood at his front door for a long moment, looking out at the rain through the small square window beside the doorframe, one hand resting on the handle of his old canvas jacket. 67 years old, retired, 2 decades of army service that had left him with a bad knee, a preference for silence, and a house that had grown very large since his wife, Margaret, had passed 18 months ago. He had kept her plants alive. He had kept her reading chair in its place by the window. He had kept the evening walks they used to take together, because stopping them felt like losing one more piece of her, and he was not ready for that. He put on the jacket. He stepped out into the rain. He had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes, his boots finding the familiar rhythm on the wet pavement, his thoughts in that quiet, empty place they often went to on these walks. Not sad, exactly, just open, the way a house feels when all its windows are slightly ajar, when he heard it. He stopped, stood completely still on the sidewalk, rain tapping against the shoulders of his jacket, and listened. There it was again. Sharp, repeating, urgent in a way that made something old and trained inside him come quietly to attention. In 20 years of service, Harold Mears had learned the difference between noise and signal. He had learned that the sounds which did not belong were the ones that demanded your full presence. His knee ached as he turned off the sidewalk. He followed the sound anyway. He moved along the fence line toward the alley entrance, his pace measured and deliberate, and when he turned the corner and saw what was there, he became completely still. The parrot fell silent the instant Harold appeared, as if his entire purpose had been accomplished. The gray cat looked up from the cage latch with those steady green eyes and held his gaze without flinching, not aggressive, not afraid, but with a directness that felt almost like communication, And inside the cage, the small brown and white dog looked at Harold Mears the way that only a creature at the very end of its endurance can look at another living being, with an expression that was equal parts terror and the most heartbreaking, fragile, aching hope. Harold felt something move through his chest that he had not felt in a long time. Not the sharp grief that ambushed him in quiet moments at home, something older than that, something that had carried him through dark places before and was offering, quietly and without ceremony, to carry him again. He crouched down slowly. He examined the latch with careful hands, hands that had learned patience through years of work that could not afford to rush. He saw immediately what the rust had done, how the mechanism had shifted and jammed, how it needed not force but precision. He pressed his thumb against the lower edge, applied gentle lateral pressure, and the latch released with a small, soft click that seemed, in the silence that followed the parrot's cries, very loud. The cage door swung open. The dog did not move right away. He sat just inside the threshold, trembling, searching Harold's face with those exhausted eyes, performing the only calculation that mattered to him in that moment, whether this was safe, whether this was real. The cat stepped quietly to the edge of the open door and sat there, just sat there, patient and still. And that, somehow, was enough. The dog crossed the threshold on trembling legs, stepped out onto the wet ground, took 2 uncertain steps forward, and pressed his small body against Harold's knee. He did not wag his tail. He simply leaned there with his entire weight, the way creatures do when they have finally, after a very long time, found the thing they were looking for. Harold placed his hand gently on the dog.
He did not speak for a long moment. He simply stayed there in the rain, crouched in an alley on Clover Street, one hand resting on a small dog who was shaking less with every passing second. He thought briefly of Margaret, who had always said that the things worth doing rarely announced themselves. They just appeared, quietly, and waited to see if you were paying attention. "All right," he said finally, his voice low and even. "You're all right now." He carried the dog home inside his jacket, one hand supporting the small, warm weight against his chest. The cat followed at a careful, dignified distance, the way cats always insist on doing, even when they have clearly already decided. The parrot watched them from his wire until they disappeared around the corner, and then he made one final soft sound, low and brief, before finding the shelter of a nearby eave. Harold named the dog Scout, because that is the right name for a soul who held his position in the dark and waited, without giving up, for someone to finally arrive. The gray cat appeared at his back porch the next morning and every morning after, until one day she simply stayed. He called her June. The parrot was reunited with his owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, 3 streets away, who cried when she saw him and made Harold a lemon cake in gratitude that he found unexpectedly moving. The house on Clover Street was no longer quiet. Scout learned to trust in the slow, deliberate way of all rescued things, one morning at a time, one walk at a time, one evening by the window watching the street go by with his chin resting on Harold's knee. June kept her own counsel, as cats do, but she was always somewhere nearby. And Harold Mears, who had walked these streets for 18 months trying to fill a space that could not be filled, found that the space had not needed filling so much as it had needed company. Some rescues announce themselves loudly, others happen in the rain, in an alley no one was watching, carried forward by a cat who refused to walk away, a parrot who refused to be silent, and a veteran who had learned long ago to follow the signal hiding inside the noise. Courage, it turns out, does not always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it has green eyes and muddy paws. Sometimes it has bright feathers and a voice that cuts through rain, and sometimes it wears an old canvas jacket and walks out into the evening even when it would be easier to stay inside. But it always shows up when it matters most. If this story found its way into your heart, then you already belong here. Subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts and join a family that believes in loyalty, in quiet courage, and in the extraordinary love that lives between animals and the humans they choose. Hit subscribe, ring that notification bell, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded today that kindness still exists, that it walks on four paws, flies on green wings, and sometimes wears old boots in the rain. We will see you in the next story, and until then, keep your heart open, because the bravest moments rarely ask for permission. They simply arrive, and they change everything.